Ας περάσουμε στο επόμενο θέμα που έχει να κάνει με την διάλεξη για το ελεύθερο πανεπιστήμιο που έγινε την Πέμπτη 22 Νοεμβρίου. Κύριος ομιλητής στη διάλεξη ήταν ο δόκτωρ Κλέαρχος Κυριακίδης, καθηγητής του Πανεπιστημίου στο Hertfordshire. Η βραδιά άρχισε με τον κύριο Νίνο Κουμέττου, ο οποίος είναι μέλος της οργανωτικής επιτροπής, όπου καλωσόρισε όλους τους παρευρισκόμενους και τον κύριο ομιλητή.
Καλησπέρα κυρίες και κύριοι. Καλωσορίσετε και πάλι εδώ στο οίκημα της ελληνικής κυπριακής αδελφότητας για μία ακόμα διάλεξη στα πλαίσια της συνεργασίας της αδελφότητας με το ελεύθερο πανεπιστήμιο, με το Κυπριακό Πανεπιστήμιο, και οι διαλέξεις αυτές ονομάζονται το Ελεύθερο Πανεπιστήμιο για την Ομογένεια του Λονδίνου. Έχει καιρό να το κάνουμε. 10ος χρόνος διάλεξη. 10 χρόνια. Γι' αυτό είμαστε ευγνώμονες και σε όλους εσάς που κάθε φορά και με τέτοιον καιρό κάνετε την προσπάθεια να είστε εδώ μαζί μας. Απόψε η διάλεξη θα έχει θέμα The prospect of partition in the United Kingdom, should Cyprus say όχι, and thereby help to guarantee the Ένωσις between England and Scotland. Εισηγητής θα είναι ο φίλος μας πλέον, από καιρό φίλος μας, ο δόκτωρ Κλέαρχος Κυριακίδης. Τον καλωσορίζουμε και πάλι. Είναι δικηγόρος, non-practicing και ο καλύτερος lecturer στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Hertfordshire, the Haviland Campus, στο Hatfield. Χορηγή επικοινωνίας της εκδήλωσης αυτής είναι, όπως πάντα, ο ελληνικός ραδιοφωνικός σταθμός Λονδίνου, το LGR, το Hellenic TV, οι εφημερίδες Ελευθερία και Παρικιακή, το Ραδιοφωνικό Ίδρυμα Κύπρου, το ΚΙΠΕ, η εφημερίδα Φιλελεύθερος. Θα ήθελα να καλέσω τον πρόεδρο της Παγκόσμιας Νεολαίας, τον φίλο μας τον Χρήστο, να μας πει λίγα λόγια για την διάλεξη.
Στη συνέχεια στο βήμα ανέβηκε ο πρόεδρος της ΝΕΠΟΜΑ, κύριος Χρήστος Καραολής, ο οποίος με τη σειρά του αναφέρθηκε στο θέμα της ομιλίας και τη σύνδεση που έχει αυτό με το πρόβλημα της Κύπρου.
Thank you, Nino. I'm going to switch to English, if I may. The lecture will be divided, or more appropriately partitioned, into 3 sections. The first part will draw attention to the fundamental differences and similarities between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Cyprus, and more specifically between Scotland and the Turkish-occupied part of the Republic. The second part will suggest that the Republic of Cyprus, its citizens and diaspora, must take an active interest in the Scottish referendum process. And the third part will focus on the matters of substance. More specifically, it will consider whether the Republic of Cyprus, its citizens and diaspora should openly object to the proposed partition of the United Kingdom, and if so, whether they should object to an independent Scotland remaining or becoming a member of the European Union. I now hand over to Andreas Loizidis to give a biographical note of Κλέαρχος.
Αμέσως μετά στο βήμα ανέβηκε το μέλος της Οργανωτικής Επιτροπής του Ελεύθερου Πανεπιστημίου στο Λονδίνο, κύριος Ανδρέας Λοϊζίδης, ο οποίος διάβασε το βιογραφικό του κύριου ομιλητή, δόκτωρ Κλέαρχο Κυριακίδη. Ας τον παρακολουθήσουμε.
Our speaker tonight is Dr. Κλέαρχος Κυριακίδης, holds an LLB Honours in Law and Politics degree from the University of Birmingham, together with a Master's in Philosophy in International Relations and a PhD in History degrees from the University of Cambridge and a postgraduate diploma in legal practice from the University of Westminster. He is a senior lecturer in the School of Law at the University of Hertfordshire, where he teaches constitutional law and professional ethics. In addition, he is a non-practicing solicitor as well as an active member of the Law Society of England and Wales. He is an executive committee member of both the West London Law Society and the Hertfordshire Law Society. He is a former research fellow of the erstwhile Royal Air Force Staff College and a former tutor at the Strategic Studies courses of Her Majesty's Forces, which used to be organised at Madingley Hall in Cambridge. His research interests draw upon his cross-disciplinary educational background. His publications primarily relate to the United Kingdom's ties with Cyprus, to the legal aspects of the Cyprus question, and quite separately to the Attorney General and the law offices of the Crown in the United Kingdom. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Kyrgyakidis.
Αμέσως μετά στο βήμα ανέβηκε ο δόκτωρ Κλέαρχος Κυριακίδης, όπου ξεκίνησε τη διάλεξή του με θέμα «The Prospect of Partition in the United Kingdom, Should Cyprus and its diaspora say όχι, and thereby help to sustain the Ένωσις of Scotland with the United Kingdom». Ας παρακολουθήσουμε ένα απόσπασμα από την ομιλία του.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for that very warm introduction. I have to do two things at the very outset. One is to thank the organisers for all of their hard work in terms of organising this evening's event. I know how much work has gone into this, and I'm grateful to them. The second thing I must do is say that everything that I will argue tonight represents my own personal views, and they should not be associated with any of the organisations with which I'm affiliated. I have to say that because I will probably end up upsetting a large number of people across the world by the time that I finish. So if I upset anybody, it's tough, but I will hold the responsibility for that. Winston Churchill spent a sizable proportion of his lengthy parliamentary career as the Member of Parliament for Dundee in Scotland. He was therefore familiar with Scotland and particularly fond of fine Scotch whisky, some of which might be drunk when the vrαδιά is served. However, Churchill was also a keen student of history, and he is said to have remarked that of all the small nations on this earth, perhaps only the ancient Greeks can surpass the Scots in their contribution to mankind. Churchill was surely right. Think of David Hume, who is often identified with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle as among the leading lights in the history of philosophy. Think of Adam Smith, the father of modern economics. Think of Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, and Sir Alexander Fleming, who first produced penicillin. With those preliminary thoughts in mind, and the joint interests of the United Kingdom and the Republic of Cyprus in mind, I have prepared this lecture in response to, this is like being a politician, being photographed. Thank you, it's okay. I prepared this lecture in response to the prospect of Scottish independence and thus the partition of what is now known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And just to recap, I'm going to begin by outlining the similarities as well as differences between the United Kingdom and Cyprus. I'm secondly going to move on to suggest that the Republic of Cyprus and its diaspora must take an active interest in the Scottish question. And thirdly, I will consider whether or not the Republic should object in public to the prospect of Scottish independence and do what Tony Blair did before the Annan Plan, meddle in the domestic politics of another country. Now let's begin with the similarities and the differences. I'm not a Member of Parliament, but I'm an academic and I ought to declare an interest. I'm a citizen of this country with roots in the Eastern Mediterranean, including in Bedra and Lisi, two villages in the Turkish-occupied part of northern Cyprus. So inevitably, I'm intrinsically hostile to the concept of partition. Scotland was once an internationally recognised independent state, in contrast to the Turkish-occupied part of the Republic. But under the Union with England Act of 1707, Scotland chose by legal means to be united with England. and England similarly chose to be united with Scotland. Today, Scotland continues to be an integral part of the United Kingdom, albeit subject to the provisions of the Scotland Act, which have introduced devolution. That's not fully fledged federation, but it's one step or two steps short of federation. That's why Scotland has its own government, its own parliament, and also its own judiciary, although it had its own judiciary even before devolution. By the same token, Wales now has its own assembly, as it's called, and its own government. Be all that as it may, the United Kingdom may be staring into the abyss of partition. Devolution, which was introduced in, after 1998, was designed to forestall the moves towards Scottish nationalism and Scottish independence. It's fuelled Scottish nationalism and the campaign for Scottish independence. And there's a lesson there to be drawn from Cyprus. As we all know, the aim in Cyprus is to establish a bizonal, bicommunal federation consisting of two politically equal communities. If that is an objective that is designed to forestall any future campaign towards fully fledged partition, the British lesson suggests otherwise. But that's another story for another day. Little history, little modern history is needed, and perhaps at this point, if this technology works, I can draw your attention to some recent history. In the Scottish parliamentary elections held in May 2011 under the devolution arrangements, the pro-independent Scottish National Party, the SNP, gained a majority of seats in the devolved Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, that magnificent city known as the Athens of the North. Thus, for the first time since devolution was introduced, the SNP took control of the devolved Scottish Government, which is also based in Edinburgh. And Alex Salmond, perhaps the most canny and wily politician in this country, if not Europe, has become the First Minister of Scotland. Not the Prime Minister, but he's known as the First Minister. Alex Salmond and his party, and the ministers within the Scottish Government, thereafter set in motion a campaign with a view to arranging a referendum in Scotland. As Mr. Salmond has put it, independence is not a single event, but a process. That's very important because I'm going to divide my analysis into process and substance, and there are lessons to be drawn for Cyprus as well. The campaign for independence is a process. I don't know if you've noticed, but when you go to Sainsbury's or Tesco or any of the other big supermarkets, when they sell produce from Scotland, they don't put the flag of the United Kingdom anymore, they put the flag of Scotland. Whereas when they sell English milk, they'll put the flag of the United Kingdom. The campaign towards independence has already begun. It's incremental, it's taking place before our eyes. There hasn't been a one-off grant of independence, but the Scots very carefully have been incrementally moving towards independence. And there's a lesson there for Cyprus. Because in 1983, as I'll explain, the regime in the occupied area declared independence unilaterally, and that failed because it was unlawful. And since then, they've been engaging in a process designed towards gradually moving towards recognition. I'm going to suggest they won't succeed ultimately, but they have learnt this lesson, the Scots. Independence can be a one-off event, but it can also be achieved gradually by stealth, and by careful moves along the way. Now, the latest pivotal development in the Scottish referendum process has been the conclusion of the Edinburgh Agreement on the 15th of October 2012, signed by Prime Minister of the United Kingdom David Cameron MP and the First Minister of Scotland Alex Salmond. The Edinburgh Agreement declares as follows, and I'm reading here from the actual agreement: the governments of the United Kingdom and Scotland are agreed that the referendum should have a clear legal base, be legislated for by the Scottish Parliament, be conducted so as to command the confidence of parliaments, governments and people, and deliver a fair test and a decisive expression of the views of the people of Scotland, and a result that everyone will respect. The governments have agreed to promote an ordering council under the Scotland Act in the United Kingdom and Scottish Parliaments to allow a single question referendum on Scottish independence to be held before the end of 2014. The order will put it beyond doubt that the Scottish Parliament can legislate for that referendum. Now, what does all that mean, and why is it significant, and what bearing does it have upon the Republic of Cyprus? First, it must be admitted, whatever one's views may be, that the constitutional future of Scotland and the process underpinning it is being, by and large, plotted in the public domain. In the Parliament of Scotland, in the Parliament of the United Kingdom, by means of press conferences, public statements, consultation papers which are published and to which the population may contribute, through public lectures, the transcripts of which are published by the ministers concerned, and other means. The future of Scotland is not being determined behind closed doors by means of secret negotiations, with no minutes published, no prior consultation exercise, and no proper means for the public to engage actively in the process. That's what's bedeviled Cyprus over the years. The process itself has been inherently undemocratic, top-down, and part of Middle Eastern politics, where people meet behind closed doors and agree things for the people to, I was going to say, suffer from. In a European democracy, and Cyprus must now be regarded as a European democracy, constitutional matters of this magnitude are by and large conducted in public, with the politicians accountable to the electorate through the ballot box and through Parliament and through the publication of the relevant documentation, so that we can see what's going on and what's being agreed. And the publication of documentation in draft form at its formative stages, so that we can have an input into the system and lobby the system. Unless I'm mistaken, none of that has happened in Cyprus, apart from the odd press conference here or leak there. So there is a lesson to be drawn, and the point has been quite rightly made by Prime Minister Cameron and Deputy Prime Minister Clegg in the preface to the United Kingdom's consultation paper, which was published in January 2012. Messrs Cameron and Clegg state, "The future of Scotland must not be worked out in secret behind closed doors." So that's the first reason why the Edinburgh Agreement is important. Secondly, the Edinburgh Agreement presages the conveyance of the power to legislate for a referendum from the Parliament of the United Kingdom to the Parliament of Scotland in Edinburgh. Indeed, a few days after the conclusion of the Edinburgh Agreement, Mr Salmond, the First Minister of Scotland, reiterated that the referendum question would be, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country? So the United Kingdom government has effectively surrendered the power to legislate for a referendum to the Scottish Parliament. I don't know what's going on in these negotiations in Cyprus, which have been going on for years, but we need to know what has been agreed behind closed doors, if anything, as to the process under which the constitutional future of the Republic of Cyprus will be determined if, and I hope it doesn't, if it is transformed into a so-called bizonal bicommunal federation. These are crucial matters that ought to be in the public domain, not kept behind closed doors. The process is crucial. Thirdly, the Edinburgh Agreement has killed off any lingering hope that the citizens of England, Wales and Northern Ireland would have their own separate referendum or referenda, or indeed whether or not Scotland should be allowed to exit the United Kingdom. So we're not going to vote in this referendum. We've been shut out of the picture. That's a mistake, in my view. There may be legal arguments that Mr Salmond could deploy to support his argument that Scotland should be given the exclusive right to have a referendum, but why are we being excluded? And in the future in Cyprus, is a similar pattern going to be played out? Is, if there's a bizonal, bicommunal federation, is the regime in the north going to follow the Scottish path and insist upon having a unilateral referendum? Now, Zbigniew Brzezinski was the national security advisor to Jimmy Carter when Carter was president in the 1970s, and he was an academic, and one of his books referred to international relations as a chess game. And this is what's going on here. There's a chess game that's being played, and the Republic of Cyprus ought to be thinking several moves ahead. Hopefully they are, but without a transparent peace process, without transparency in those negotiations, we're at a loss to know whether or not these sorts of procedural matters are being discussed behind closed doors, and if they are being discussed behind closed doors, what is being stitched into the detail. Fourthly, the Edinburgh Agreement expressly confirms that the referendum must be legal. Meanwhile, it's implicit in the Edinburgh Agreement, even though it doesn't spell it out, that in the event of a yes vote in a referendum, any subsequent breakup of the United Kingdom must likewise be legal. Now, in the event of a breakup of the United Kingdom, let me just go back to the map of, sorry, I'm going forwards there. Let's go back to the map of the United Kingdom. In the event of a yes vote, so I'm playing a bit of chess here and I'm thinking several moves ahead. In the event of a yes vote in favour of Scottish independence, the likeliest option would be for Scotland to eventually withdraw from the United Kingdom by means of a mutually agreed act of secession. It's a carving out or a splitting away. So the United Kingdom will remain in place, but Scotland would then emerge as a new state, a new sovereign state. Another less likely option may be for the United Kingdom to be dissolved altogether and for two new states to emerge from the ashes. Now you can see the parallels here with Cyprus. They're talking about the creation of two constituent states under a loose federal umbrella. Well, what's going to happen? Is there going to be a dissolution of the Republic of Cyprus and then the birth of two new states under a federal umbrella? And is that federal umbrella going to be a new state? Or is the new state of affairs, to use the Annan Plan terminology, going to act as a successor to the previous state? These are fairly fundamental procedural questions that ought to be in the public domain. I don't know, perhaps you can tell me, I may be wrong. Has there been a consultation exercise with all of these documents placed in the public domain? Has the Attorney General of Cyprus given public lectures in which he set out the legal position, as the Scottish Advocate General has quite rightly done?
Εδώ να σας αναφέρουμε ότι ολόκληρη τη διάλεξη του δόκτωρ Κυριακίδη θα την παρακολουθήσετε προσεχώς στο Hellenic TV.